Today. All right, first of all, let's just ask you a couple of questions about your reading. What did Crosby say about where different people are in the world today compared to where they were 2,000 years ago? Everybody stayed where they were from 2,000 years ago, except for the Europeans, and people moved by the Europeans. Okay? The Chinese are in China, the Vietnamese are in Vietnam, Africans are in Africa. The Europeans are all over the place. They're found all over the Americas, north and south. They're found all over, more or less all over Africa, especially South Africa. And they're found in Australia and New Zealand. Of course, most of these faces here are European faces. Why, according to Crosby, was this the case? Aggressiveness. All right? Now, is he right or not? I leave that up for you to decide. But they certainly have been hustling, attempting to increase their wealth. Now, is this consistent with Diamond? Yeah. Bill?
No.
No. Okay, I agree. Why?
Diamond writes and believes that the environment caused all this to happen. Well, he's not saying that it was differences in the people, he was saying it was the differences in the places.
Good answer. Good answer. Who's right? I don't know. I mean, you know, you're going to find lots of nasty people in history all over the world. No question about that. Europeans are right up there. But, well, those are two hypotheses, perhaps, about why Europeans are affected. Now, somebody over here said something I agree with, that Europeans had special tools, including special plants and animals, to help them exploit their environment. And I think they did a good job, that Diamond does a good job in explaining this. And we're going to focus on this a little bit more today. Okay, now who was the guy I was supposed to ask a question from last time? Wasn't prepared last time. So, yeah, there we are. Okay, you ready today?
Sure.
Okay, why did diseases affect indigenous people more than the Europeans who brought them, especially when they moved to the New World? New World is where we are.
Because the Europeans that brought them had already developed a tolerance to them.
Okay, what do we call that tolerance?
Immune system.
Immune system. You are vaguely European, some of you European genes in there. So this guy somewhere in here has got pretty good antibodies to lots of stuff like crummy old flu. And what's the name of some other diseases that wiped out the native folks here in large numbers? Smallpox, and so forth, okay? Of course, you know, hey, the smallpox might be back. Who's going to be the winner in this long evolutionary battle? You or the smallpox? Well, we'll see. Okay, now, why did the Europeans, according to Diamond, I want a one-word answer, why did the Europeans have these genes to protect themselves from smallpox when smallpox, possibly, or many influenza, that's a better example, influenza, when influenza originated in Asia? One-word answer.
Luck.
Begins with G.
Genes.
No. Only indirectly. What's the answer? Geography. What's Diamond about is geography, all right? Geography. Why? The genes, the germ diseases go east and west too. Okay, so most of these influenza and kind of diseases and stuff started off over here, and they could go this way, but they couldn't go from here to here, or here to here, until Europeans brought their big sailing ships that could cross the oceans. Okay, Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. Remember that song? Now, what do you think about Columbus after reading Zinn, Mr. Gray Shirt right there? That guy in front of you.
Yeah, I don't
Speak up.
I don't think he's that good.
Not that good of a person. He was a real son of a bitch, huh? Did you know that before?
No,
How many knew that Columbus was a real son of a bitch before? Well, that's pretty good. Half of you. How many learned something from reading that? Zinn is pretty powerful, I think. Really, I saw him on TV a while ago, and he's really in there, really still kicking ass. I'll tell you, he's got a lot to say. Okay, well, what does that have to do? I mean, where did you guys who raised your hand that you knew Columbus wasn't necessarily the sweetest guy under the stars? Where did you learn that? In your high school history? How many learned it in their high school history? Now we're down to about 20% of the class. All right. Why didn't you learn that in your high school history? There's a rule about history. Anybody know the rule of history?
It's written by the winners.
History is written by the winners. Who are the winners? Hey. All right. How many of you folks wish to say you got Native American genes in you that you know of? Oh, fair number. Great. Okay. But not the majority. Who, if we came here 300 years ago, how many Europeans were living on this hill? 0. The strongest army on the continent was from the 5 nations of the Iroquois that lived here. How did we ever defeat them? Disease. Subterfuge. Cut down their orchards. Burn their crops. Really nasty things. My ancestors, maybe. I don't know what they were doing. Okay, let's take a look then. Not too bad. You're off my S list, except remember the G word. And let's go on. Okay, here's people moving around the world. Whatever it is that Homo sapiens apparently evolved in Africa 7 million years ago. They moved up. 1 million years ago, they started going up into the Levant, this part of the Mediterranean, across India into China. These are fantastic places for people to live. They got monsoon climates, really good for agriculture, rich and warm environment, good place for folks to go. And then later they went into Europe after they evolved the technology of spears and the ability to get animal skins and use knife blades to cut it up and so forth. All of them energy concentration devices. Now, while this is going on, the human population is increasing. Not much compared to today, but it's increasing quite a bit. And the important thing that's going on really is not how many people are on the earth. Nobody cares about that. But the density of people. And so the hectares available for every person. Now this is kind of going backwards. This is the old days. When there were 25,000 hectares per person. Well, how big is 25,000 hectares? Roughly Onondaga County, I guess. Well, you know, there was lots of hectares per person. And then Paleolithic, Old Stone Age, New Stone Age with shape tools and so forth. But until you get to agriculture, you needed about 2,000 hectares, roughly a square mile, to support a person. Why?
The concentration of energy per area.
Well, there's a lot of concentration of energy per hectare in an Adirondack forest. But usable is the key, or edible. Now, why is most of nature, most plant material, for example, why is it not edible? Natural selection? Good, good, come on. You're right, but let's have a little more details.
Like the plants that get eaten don't pass on their genes.
Good for you. Okay. The plants that get eaten don't pass on their genes. Right? And what plants don't get eaten? Well, you don't know enough about this yet, and I'll give you the clue, is the plants that don't get eaten are the plants that have chemical defenses. Okay, now, how many of you have any experience with cannabis? I better not ask that. Yeah, a few of you, all right? No, that row back there, man, real heavy. All right. Now, don't send that to their mothers. Okay. What's this tetra, whatever it is, cannibal? Who can say it? All right, there you go. Hope you're going to be a chem major. All right. And so, what general class of chemicals is it? Alkaloids. All right. And why would cannabis go to the business of manufacturing this? For your pleasure?
No. Animals are less likely to survive if they're in high.
Same for yourself, perhaps. Especially if you drive. But sure, a bug is walking along on this thing and chewing this stuff, and presumably he's going to get high too and get dizzy and fall off. All right? Look at all the stuff that you eat that is actually phytotoxins, toxins of plants. Mustard oil is used as a nerve gas in World War I. So you eat mustard on your hot dog or whatever, and it's good in a little bit, but if you ate pure mustard, you get very sick and you die. And likewise, caffeine in coffee and tea, you know, that wasn't evolved to give you a little high, a little jump. It was evolved as a chemical defense against plants. Coffee doesn't have a lot of plant pests. It's got this caffeine in it, or tea. That's why we can raise it easily in monocultures. Now, all of human action in changing the crop structure is breeding out these nasty chemicals, so that when you eat rice or corn, you know, there's no plant defenses left at all, and that means that that means it's better tasting for the insects too, right? And so that means that our agricultural crops, then we have to come up with these artificial pesticides to protect them. That's a complicated story. We'll get into that more later. Okay, so when you go above what you can support, humans expanded until they got to some kind of carrying capacity. And you've got to be careful about carrying capacity. We don't know exactly what it is or what it means. But in a hunter-gathering lifestyle, there's no place that we can find, like the Kung, where you can support more than about one person per square mile. And if you go above that, you have to engineer nature to redirect energy flows here. And we're going to talk about what that means. Now, when we talk about population growth, I want you to know it isn't just a one-shot deal. It isn't just it increases over time. And so we take some ancient civilizations. And this is Egypt from 500 BC to 2000 AD. And they had a highly developed civilization and civil service and records and so forth going back then. So we have a lot of knowledge. And the population of Egypt, which is a very crowded country, at about 700 years before Christ, was about what it is now. And what's happened in between? Well, you know, the Persian and Macedonian and Roman conquest and plagues and Arab conquest, and plague leaves and plague comes back, and Black Death and Turkish conquest. Sounds like fun, huh? So, where we have records, the people certainly bump up and down over long periods of time. We also have a lot of long-term records in China, also a very long civilization compared to, for example, Europe. So the population isn't always up. Here's how many folks with Irish genes in you? Wow. So They all came over here with a potato famine. You all, welcome. I mean, okay, so that's a sort of a brief history of human populations. Human populations as the driver of events. But let's go back to the first topic, which is, Laura, are we ready with this stuff? Okay, what are you doing here? Wait, why don't you do it? Can I just... All right, let's go forward. See, it doesn't work. I want to read to you a couple of quotes from a book that is in a series that's put out by the American Historical Society. And this is what modern historians are saying now. Until the past 2 or 3 decades, world history has been a neglected and often disdained stepchild within the historical profession. Just hasn't been done. 19th century national history is often blatantly chauvinistic. What do you mean by chauvinistic? What's chauvinistic? Is Zinn a chauvinist?
Favoring some groups over others.
Yeah, your group. Chauvinistic means us guys are the good guys. Right? So Zinn is the opposite pole from the chauvinist, right? So history's often been chauvinist, certainly the kind of history that you get in your high schools probably. Is that right? How many had chauvinistic history? The Americans are the good guys, right? Everybody, just about. If you're in the orange, you didn't have chauvinistic history in the high school?
I was friends with my history teacher, so he kind of showed me the...
He kind of showed you the reality? Yeah, good, okay. Was it good? Yeah, good history teacher. Well, you go thank him. Okay. We're the favorite at the expense of general surveys of the human experience. So we're trying to look at the general situation of human experience, in part because in a class this large, we probably have folks from all kinds of different backgrounds, not just New York State. And fortunately, that's changing quite a bit now. Some of the great early historians, somewhat chauvinistic, who tried to put things together were Toynbee and Spindler, but, okay, he's talking about the evolution away from what their school boards had said history ought to be, and they seem to be thematically focused on recurring processes such as changes in military organization and patterns of colonization, and we might say exploitation, using Crosby's words, or on such cross-cultural phenomena as the spread of disease, technology, and trading networks. Sounds like our textbook here, right? Sounds like guns, germs, and steel. Rigorous application of the comparative method. So the point I'm trying to make to you is that this is written by the president of the American History Society, and he's a little bit embarrassed. He says that we have kind of blown it. We've given you an inaccurate view of history. So there is a great change in how we think about doing history, and that's the important thing. And here are some books. I'm trying to write a book on energy and history now, and I'm not sure how successful it is. It's very interesting. I always was fascinated with history. The reason was it started this way was that my father was a very good Christian gentleman, a wonderful father, and a pacifist. But in 1944, the year after I was born, in 1945, he was out in the Pacific Ocean shooting big guns at people he had no argument with, and whom he, later on in his life he came to like very much. But why was my father out in the Pacific Ocean shooting guns at Japanese people? I wondered about that. So I started reading the history of World War II, and man, I got hooked. Got really, really interesting to me. So I've gone on, and in my spare time, I read a great deal of history. And mostly I read specific histories about Stalingrad or Napoleon or the ancient Greeks or whatever. But there are some very good books that are out now that are giving us a very, very different view of history. And one is written by an ecologist, Paul Collinville, somebody I know or used to know pretty well, at Ohio State. It's called The Fates of Nations. And he says there's a basic pattern in history. There's overpopulation, overexploitation of resources, a lot of pressure on the local governments to go out and get new resources, so they go out and they steal somebody else's land, and that's history. And he says it's sort of an ecological thing. It's a relation of people to land and resources that drives history. Well, that's one view. Okay, Painter, who I also know very well, just spent time with him in an anthropology meeting. We were on the same panel. And he's an archaeologist. What's an archaeologist? Yeah, digs up old stuff. Okay, archaeo means old. They dig up old bones, and they dig up old cities and so forth. This is some archaeological stuff. So Tanger is a archaeologist, works for the Forest Service, and his big thing is, if you look at history, there's anywhere from 12 to 600 ancient civilizations, ancient cities that at one time were as big and proud as we are now, that are just dust now. So he says things collapse. Civilizations collapse. They collapse because they get big, and they get bigger, and they exploit more resources. They use up the resources close to home. They need to have a whole lot of what he calls complexity to maintain the empire that they're building. That means big monuments and armies and roads, and got to support all that kind of stuff. And that's an energy drain on the system, on that civilization, and eventually the energy cost becomes greater than the energy gain. And within a very short period of time, he gives example after example after example of civilizations that just collapse. And we'll look at a few of these. Poof. And he's very strongly an ecologist and very strongly a believer in the importance of energy to these sorts of things. Next. This is Addis, is the guy who I just read that quote from. And this is also the attempt of the American History Society to write an accurate history. Now, what does an accurate history mean? We'll look at a little bit of this, but it's based on facts, not on the interpretation of the facts by the winners. And we have new tools, radiocarbon data, radioactive dating, all kinds of new archaeological digs, all kinds of things that allow us to have a much more factual-based, scientific, hypothesis-testing view of history. And so this is a whole series by the American Historical Association. For that reason, this incidentally shows Europeans coming for the first time to India. And here's a bunch of Indian folks and an elephant that, of course, was not. By that time, Europeans had wiped out all their elephants. Next. Those of you, how many of you want to become an ecologist, maybe? Okay, not too many. You're going to be. Okay, so I'm an ecologist. So this guy writes a green history of the world. He's an ecologist, another ecologist like Collinville. And this is really, really interesting. It's not the best one, but it's very, very interesting. And again, the themes are the same, and we'll cover them next. This is the best one, Perlin. A Forest Journey. Everybody at this forestry college, such as we are, should read this book. It's only $12 from Harvard University Press, and it's great. And what is history all about? History is all about chopping down trees. We'll talk about that a little bit. Next. This is interesting, and here's our Easter Island stuff, incidentally. Redmond, this is a new book from University of Arizona Press, and the human impact on ancient environments. Environmental impact is nothing new. Environmental impact has been with us for 10,000, 100,000 years. Now, we're cranking up the scale for sure. Now, when I say impact, is it good or bad? I'm not saying it's all bad. I'm just saying that there are changes as a result, and we need to understand what some of these changes are. And I hope in my teaching I don't ever say to you, hardly ever, good or bad. That's not the point, unless you ask me. Then we have an editorial. We're not talking about good or bad, we're just talking about reality as best we are able to understand. Okay? So, next. This guy Smith was a very smart guy. He's already written the book I wanted to write, so I'm not quite sure what to do now. So next. Now the first thing is we've got to talk about energy sources. We've got a tool here. This is a device for pumping water. How did people used to pump water? With human muscles. So this was a prisoner in the old days in England. What a drag, man. And so you run this thing with your human muscles and pump up water so some rich lady can take a bath or whatever. And you work for an hour. There's the hourglass there. And then you get to rest. This guy's just about dead. And then you rest for an hour. And then it's your turn at the crank again. So human muscles powered civilization, early civilization, for a long time. And also we had animal, whoops, I guess that one didn't make it. Well, we had some pictures of machines of animals, horses going round and round and round, driving a millstone or something. Oh, there it is. Okay, horses going round and round. Here's an ox or a cow or something here. Forever walking here. See, it goes round and round and it drives all this machinery. Now, what's driving this machine now? In the black, right there. What's driving this machine? Where's the energy coming from? You, yeah.
The horses. The horses are the horses' muscles.
The horse's muscles, which is power, that's the machine. That's the automobile. What's the fuel?
The food that the horses eat.
Right, which comes from?
The sun.
The sun. Thank you. Okay, now, we were supposed to look this up, but I believe these stone tools here, they found in China, are 500,000 years old. They can date the charcoal remains that are left of them 500,000 years ago. Those are pretty sophisticated looking tools, aren't they? I bet there's hardly a person in this room that could make tools like that as good as the folks were that made these. They're probably spear points, or they're probably, if you got some, you want to hack up some animal carcass, or you want to hack another person, or cut off some tree limbs to build your hut out of, or whatever. General purpose axe head, I don't know if they had evolved to the point where they put them on a stick to increase the force. They look basically to me like a spear point. Here's some old European various kinds of spear points. And you see some of them are pretty nicely fashioned. You can walk around in plowed fields in New York, and there are many people who do this, and find these kinds of things left over from the people that lived here 300, 500, 10,000 years ago, that were hunters and gatherers and who used implements like this. Here are also some made out of bone, and you can see this is a barb. Looks like a pretty good thing to catch a fish with, right? You get that thing in the fish and you're probably not going to get away because of the barbs, just like a modern fish will catch that. Okay, next. All right, now then something happened. We were Stone Age people, or more or less people, I'd say people, for 2 million years. Maybe 7 million people if you want to go back to the pre-Homo sapiens. I guess Homo sapiens we've been for, 500,000 years? About 500,000 years? More or less. So, then something happened about 1,500 years before Christ, 3,500 years ago. Something happened. And what happened was the discovery of iron and copper first, and metals in general, gold and silver. And probably what happened was that people are sitting around a campfire, maybe in Crete, island in the Mediterranean, and their campfire is made with rocks, you know, so they can hold the cooking heat. And same reason we make campfire with rocks today, so it doesn't go burn your tent down. And they got a good hot fire, and then all of a sudden this beautiful stuff comes out of the rocks. And people go, whoa, what is that? It's copper, pure copper, got melted out of the rock. And they say, what is this stuff? So maybe they wore it for jewelry for a while, and after a while they say, oh, hey, look, you know, we can sharpen it and make a pretty good knife blade out of it. And, oh, hey, let's make a spear point out of it. Oh, let's make an axe head and hit the other people in the next village on the head with it. It looks a lot better than stones, and so forth. So the development of metallurgy took place especially in this part of the Mediterranean. This is Italy here and Greece. And earliest maybe in this part of what's now, I guess, Turkey mostly. And it began to spread. It apparently was evolved independently in Africa. There's sites in South Africa, too, that are not on this. In India, in China. I don't know whether it was spread by traders or people developed it quite independently, but I guess people were just observant, and they began to develop more and more complex metallurgy. And so all of a sudden we had all kinds of metal tools. And they are, for example, here is an axe head. This is a bracelet, an axe head, a spear point. And you can get sharper, tougher, more potent work tools that allow you to accelerate or increase the impact of your own muscles more and more with bronze tools. And bronze tools became very common. So here's a person in their, probably a person of some status, and they find pottery, but a lot of bronze pots and various kinds of things that are buried with this obvious person of high status, because these pots were very valuable to them. Right? Basically what happened was this, and this is from Perlin's book, A Forest Journey. People would discover some metal, bronze in Crete, silver near Athens, metals and iron at various other places, and they'd say, wow, this is great stuff. And that's great stuff for two reasons. Number one, it was useful as tools. And number two, it was important in trade. And trade became very important around the world. And so what happened is the use of these tools then, about 1,000 to 500 years before Christ, suddenly spread all around the world. These metal tools. And here's some other examples of tools. Here's I think Rick showed this last time, an early sickle, but the point is you have a sharp point here. So you're concentrating your energy the same way a knife blade does. And that allows you to harvest your grains much more easily. And then you came up with the idea of a plow that you could hook to an ox or a horse or something, and you could drag this thing around. And that would tremendously increase your ability to exploit a hectare of land, because you could plow it all up and put in your seeds instead of all of nature's stuff. And you concentrate all that solar energy into whatever it is that was useful to humans. And so this went on through time. Another important tool humans evolved was the millstone for grinding grain. Grain by itself, especially prior to widespread use of fire, is pretty tough to chew, and you grind it up to flour, and you can make much more interesting foods out of it, including, of course, bread. Oh, incidentally, I just found That's the early kiln or forge for making iron. And these have been around now for 4,000 or 5,000 years. And they found them developed quite independently, for example, in Peru. Okay. So, what did all of these tools allow people to do? Well, they increase the ability to exploit plants and animals, exploit the resources of where they live. Now, you can see this in, here's one of the tools by which we understand this. Here is a pollen car from France, northern France. You take a pipe and you drop it down into the mud at the bottom of a lake that's been around for a long time, and you slice it into thin layers, and you look through the microscope and you find what kind of pollen is there. The pollen is telling you what kind of plants grew there. And so if we go up in this region up to 4,000 years before Christ, there are not very many grasses, and they're mostly forest species. Hazel, oak, especially elm, pine, there's these forest species. And then, boom, all of a sudden you get a whole lot of pollen from grasses. And these are mostly agricultural grasses. That's mostly what agricultural plants are, is agriculture. So boom, you get a whole bunch of this, and you have a falling off of most of the forest species. Not all of them, but most of them. Hazel seems to do a little bit better. But then you find a decrease, probably having to do with overexploitation of the soil, soil erosion, perhaps a collapse of a culture, and then the forest species start coming back again, and then the cycle happens all over again. We find this again and again and again around the world, that the agricultural species displace the natural forest species that would be there otherwise, or perhaps savanna or grassland species, and but for a while. And it's kind of hard for us to think now that huge areas like all of northern France before the time of Christ were completely cleared. But that's what seems to have taken place. And even overexploited at that time. And one of the principal uses of sources of the deforestation was material for mines, and mining and especially smelting. Smelting is what you do to make metals. It basically means melting. It requires charcoal. And some of this, here's an old copper mine in China thousands of years ago. Look at what they had developed. There's buckets, and they don't have a person for scale, but I guess a person's about this big. In there exploiting that copper thousands of years ago. Now, they also had to exploit enormous areas of forest for the trees to take the ore. Ore is the metal mixed with dirt, something you don't want. And they had to get this energy to get the metal out of it. And so, entire regions, such as the Peloponnesian Peninsula of Greece, such as India, were deforested as many as 3 times in the past. All the wood was burned to make metals in Greece, to make silver, for example, and to make ships. And the net effect was you got a lot of good agricultural land for a while because you got rid of the forest until the soil was gone. And the only other real source of energy besides solar energy for a long, long time was wind power, which in fact is a kind of solar energy. Now, as Rick talked about last time, this increased surplus energy that often came with agriculture, not always, because remember, people got smaller. The diet didn't seem to be as good, but there's lots of food to support lots of people, and that allowed the evolution of of agriculture, trade, urbanization, surplus goods from one place. The early trade, a lot of it was in this region here, the Indian Ocean, between Africa and Arabia and India, Chinese coastal trade, and the Mediterranean was an especially important area where they evolved ships in trade, in business ventures, and capitalism, and all of these things to trade resources with other folks. Next. Now, this also allowed, dim the lights a bit, the evolution of very dense concentrations of people. And this is the ancient city of Ur, which is in the Fertile Crescent. U-R. What word do we get from this first big city? Urban. Urban. This is Ur, and this is what it looks like now after, mostly until very recently, it looked like this. Nobody even knew the city was there. And there's maybe 20 of these big cities in the Fertile Crescent area of what's now present day, probably Iraq or maybe Jordan. And they're starting to excavate it, and they find these incredible, huge temples. There's a tractor right there and a pretty good-sized truck. Huge temples and enormous city areas. And you can't see it very well in this picture, but it's all surrounded by defensive walls. So one of the things that evolved at this time was more and more warfare. And people began to find out that it was easier to make a living by stealing stuff from your neighbor than it was to do all the work yourself. Lights up, please. And so, how do you support this many people in an area with probably not very high-yielding agriculture? Well, the answer is you didn't do it for a long time. That's one answer. Next. Here's ancient Rome, and I just want to show you this. The importance of warfare was such that all of Rome was surrounded by a defensive wall to keep the people you didn't want in out. Worked for a while, worked for a long time. So much of human history then was based upon warfare. Next. Here is ancient Greece, and Athens is here. Oh, no, Athens is right here, and Sparta. Where's Sparta? Sparta's over there somewhere. Anyway, Athens and Sparta were fighting each other for a long, long time. And the Greeks were kind of rulers of that part of the world for a while. And it started out, it was because of Greek military technology. So, next, the big people who were competing with the Greeks at that time for control of the Eastern Mediterranean were the Persians. And the Persians had chariots. And that was their war machine. And this shows the chariots running over all the bodies of the people that they've killed. Lovely. So at one point at Arabella, the Greeks under Alexander came and fought the Persians under Darius. And Darius had an army that was estimated at between 1/2 and 1 million men. Greeks had an army of 47,000. The Greeks won and changed history. That's why probably we have a Greek-based governmental system and even a system of learning. What the Greeks had was called a phalanx. And this is an early picture of an early phalanx, but let's look at a more developed one. Next. And basically they have a whole bunch of guys up here in the front with shields and long spears with a piece of iron on the end. Very unpleasant device. And this phalanx was very, very potent. And so when the chariots would charge the phalanx, the Greeks would, and the important thing is the discipline of the Greek soldiers. When the chariots would charge the phalanx, these guys were so heavily disciplined that they'd give an order and they'd just open up like this. The chariots would go right down the middle, finding no Greeks, and the Greeks would have some guys hidden in here that were good javelin throwers. And they'd come up behind the Persians and stab them in the back with their javelin. And 47,000 people beat between 10 and 20 times their number with this new iron-based military technology. And I'm going to leave you there to think about that.
Thank you very much.